we continue now with the reading, which is from the Old Testament book of Job, the 19th chapter. Where Job says, "Oh, that my words were written down, that they were inscribed in a book. Oh, that with an iron pen and with lead they were engraved on a rock forever. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and that at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, then in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see on my side, and my eyes shall behold, and not another." Here is the reading. Years ago, when I was in my early years, during my early years of ministry, I had a parishioner who I'll call Doug. Now, Doug was one of those people who always had a smile on his face and who loved to laugh, an infectious laugh, in fact. Just one of those people you couldn't help liking and who was always a pleasure to be around. Because nothing ever seemed to faze him or get him down. But most of all, Doug was a person of great faith. Something he definitely needed, as I eventually came to find out. Doug was married. He and his wife, we'll call her Linda, were both wonderful people. And what's more, pillars of our church as well. Doug was a banker, and so he served on our finance committee. Linda, for her part, headed up our evangelism committee and always alerted me on her way out of church to the presence of any guests in our worship that morning. But unfortunately, Linda, some years earlier, had developed a debilitating illness that required ongoing treatments, which over time took a severe toll on her physical health and well-being. In other words, the cure was almost as bad as the disease itself. One of the consequences of the disease and its treatment, unfortunately, besides making it impossible eventually for her to work outside the home, was that Linda could not have any children of her own. And not letting that stand in the way of their desire to have a family, however, Doug and Linda adopted not one but 2 children whom they adored. But that's not the end of the story. Not too long after I had become their pastor, maybe a year or so, Doug and Linda went to Hawaii on a second honeymoon. And while they were there, Linda died. She finally lost her battle to the dreaded disease that she'd been fighting for most of her adult life. Doug, of course, was devastated, and even worse, forced to return home alone. And because of the distance involved and the prohibitive cost, Linda was cremated. And I was there with Doug and the children, now teenagers, when her cremains were finally delivered a couple of weeks later. But that's not the end of the story. Shortly afterwards, Doug discovered that their teenage daughter was pregnant. We'll call her Sally. Sally was only 15 years old at the time, as I recall. But that's not the end of the story. Because soon after that, still reeling from the death of his wife and the shocking news that Sally was expecting a child out of wedlock, Doug also found out that this was not their daughter's first pregnancy. Apparently the year before, and totally unbeknownst to her parents, she'd had an abortion. How that ever happened, I don't know. Now pregnant again, and by the same boy, no less. She decided this time to carry the baby to term and to put it up for adoption. There was a sense in which she was giving some couple the very same gift that a young woman had once given Doug and Linda themselves years before, and both she and Doug felt good about that. But that's not the end of the story. You see, even before Linda's death, she and Doug had been having some problems with their son as well. We'll call him Tom. Tom was getting into trouble in school and then graduated on to some mischief in the neighborhood, including breaking and entering into several local homes. But Tom always seemed to have a good excuse or explanation for his behavior, however. And Doug and Linda, before her death, always believed him. And looking back on it now, they probably shouldn't have. But that's not the end of the story. By this time, I had left the congregation and taken a new call, but we stayed in touch with some of our former members, and we heard from them that eventually Tom finished high school and then left home. He ended up in Texas, where he was convicted of robbing a convenience store at knife point and sent away to prison. But that's not the end of the story. Upon his release from prison, Tom returned to the East Coast, and despite Doug's best efforts to help him, soon ended up homeless on the streets of New York City. There were weeks and even months when Doug didn't know where he was. It all finally made sense, though. You see, even though Doug and Linda had always known that there was some evidence of it in Tom's birth parents, Doug now had to finally concede that Tom as well was suffering from mental illness. But that's not the end of the story. One bitterly cold winter evening, after Doug had not heard from Tom for weeks, Out of the blue, he suddenly got a call from his son. Tom had found his way to a homeless shelter and was safe and warm. Doug was relieved, but that's not the end of the story. Just days later, Doug received the news that Tom had committed suicide. Had Tom not been living in that homeless shelter, Doug might never have known what had happened to his son. And so it was a blessing of sorts. In fact, when Doug called to tell me what had happened, he even said so himself. But that's not the end of the story. The next blow that Doug had to deal with, as we once again learned from former members, was that he was let go from his job at the bank in a downsizing move. But that's not the end of the story. Because a few years later, after landing back on his feet professionally, we learned that Doug now had cancer. Pancreatic cancer, as a matter of fact. The type of cancer, as I heard on the news just the other day, with only a 9% cure rate. But that's not the end of the story. Lo and behold, about a year after that, long after we'd simply assumed that he must have died, Jeanette received a friend request on Facebook from someone identifying himself as Doug. Unbelievably. Somehow, some way, Doug was still alive, but even that's not the end of the story. As we later learned, during this period of time, Doug and his longtime girlfriend had finally gotten married, and he kept right on courageously fighting his cancer, never letting the gravity of the situation get the best of him. That is, until the cancer finally did have its way. But in all that time, and especially with all that suffering and tragedy he had endured, enough to fill several lifetimes, not just one, Doug's faith apparently never wavered. He was still the same Doug, mutual friends told us later, until the day he died, always smiling, always laughing, always finding a way to stay positive and upbeat, even though life dished out to him more hurt and pain than any person should ever have to face. And that's the end of the story. How did he do it? I often ask myself. How did he endure and persevere and overcome all that sadness and suffering? Clearly, Doug was a remarkable human being, but it had to be something more than that. It just had to have been. I know for a fact that I could never have done it, never could have endured what he had gone through, at least not with my faith intact. And certainly not with the same grace and positive attitude and, again, hopeful faith that he exhibited right up to until the very day he died. How, I ask myself, did he maintain such hope amidst such suffering? Ironically, coincidentally, however you choose to characterize it, the latest Bible study that I led this past Saturday morning for the gathering of men, this one on the New Testament, was written, as it turns out, by a professor at the University of North Carolina for whom that question of suffering eventually led directly to a personal crisis of faith. His name is Bart Ehrman, and I'd like to let him describe that crisis in his very own words, taken from his book entitled God's Problem, How the Bible Fails to Answer Our Most Important Question, Why We Suffer. If there is an all-powerful and loving God in this world, writes Ehrman, why is there so much excruciating pain and unspeakable suffering? The problem of suffering has haunted me for a very long time, he says. Ultimately, it was the reason I lost my faith. I no longer go to church, no longer believe, no longer consider myself a Christian. The problem of suffering became, for me, the problem of faith. Now, Professor Ehrman is certainly not the first person to ever struggle with the question of human suffering, nor is he the first person who's ever lost or renounced their Christian faith because of it either. You see, the problem of trying to understand the reality of suffering in the world is an age-old problem, one that has challenged, and just as it was for Professor Ehrman, also haunted people of faith from the very beginning. How can an all-powerful and loving God allow such suffering to take place? How indeed? With all due respect to Dr. Ehrman, who's clearly a very learned man, also a very fine scholar, a loss of faith is not the only response or even a foregone conclusion when one struggles with this issue of human suffering. My late friend Doug is a perfect example. And here's the interesting thing. From everything I've read about him thus far, the problem of human suffering was and is for Dr. Ehrman apparently purely an academic or intellectual one. In other words, it was not his own personal encounter with suffering, at least as far as I can tell, that led him to first question and then eventually reject his faith. Instead, it was simply the reality of suffering in the world in a general sense, and there's no denying that reality. Contrast this, however, with my friend Doug, for whom suffering was a very personal, constant, and recurring theme throughout his entire adult life. And yet through it all, unlike Professor Ehrman, Doug did not lose faith. Doug did not lose hope. And yet how is that even possible, given what he was forced to experience and endure? Again, no disrespect to Professor Ehrman, but when he writes that the Bible fails to answer the question of why there is so much suffering in the world, I would counter-argue that understanding why there is so much suffering is actually the wrong question to be asking. A much better question in my mind is this: how is it possible to have hope in the midst of that suffering? In the midst of suffering, quite frankly, that we cannot and never will understand. Suffering is real, there's no doubt about it. However, understanding why, spoiler alert, is ultimately unknowable. And so what the issue really boils down to instead is this: how can you or I have hope in suffering, even profound, prolonged, unremitting suffering? And here the Bible is actually full of passages and verses that talk about the possibility of having hope despite the pain and reality of suffering. They may not ultimately be satisfying or conclusive, especially for someone like Professor Ehrman, but it's simply not true to imply that they don't exist. And one of those passages was our reading this evening from the book of Job in the Old Testament. Now, even if you aren't familiar with the details of his story, many, if not most of you, know at least something about the life of Job, especially about his suffering. Just like my friend Doug, the biblical Job was forced to endure one problem or setback or tragedy after another. Suffering became for him as well a constant companion. In quick succession, he lost his wealth, his children, and then even his health. Covered with boils from head to toe, Job was soon cursing the day he was born and wishing he would die. And to make matters even worse, his closest friends accused him of somehow deserving this suffering. Surely he must have done something wrong to bring this upon himself. Just like the concept of karma in Hinduism and Buddhism, which assumes that in life what goes around comes around, it's a very common conclusion or belief even today that we somehow bring suffering upon ourselves. But Job asserts, indeed Job knows, that he's done nothing to deserve the calamities that have befallen him. It's just so unfair. But life isn't always fair, is it? Once when comedian Bob Hope was receiving a major award, he quipped, "I don't deserve this." And then after a brief pause he added, "But then I have arthritis, I don't deserve that either." Having lost his wealth, his children, and his health, and then accused by his friend, Job falls into despair. Even worse, Job feels that God has now turned against him as well. With nowhere else to turn, Job turns to the only source of help he has left. He turns to the God whom he has just actually accused of bringing this suffering upon him, whom he believes has in fact abandoned him. And yet despite all the suffering that he's been forced to endure, despite being abandoned by those closest to him, even God apparently, despite the fact that Job knows in his heart that he doesn't truly deserve all that has happened to him, despite all of this, Job pronounces, "I know that my Redeemer lives." A Redeemer in Hebrew tradition, according to Old Testament professor Daniel Simonson, is the next of kin who performs certain acts on behalf of a relative who is not able to take care of them himself, usually because of death. For example, says Dr. Simonson, the Redeemer may be the one who avenges the death of a family member who's been murdered, or who buys back property that might otherwise be lost to the family because of debt, or marries a widow in order to provide the deceased man with descendants. But sometimes, says Dr. Simonson, when there seems to be no hope that a human being will step forward to take that part of next of kin in these situations, it's God who now must be the Redeemer. And this is Job's prayer. This is Job's hope. He appeals to the only one he had left, even as he lays the blame for his suffering right at God's feet. With nowhere else to turn, Job turns to the very God that he accuses of abandoning him. In the end, God is his only hope. And here's the thing, the really cool thing, if you ask me. At this time, you see, there was no belief in the possibility of a resurrection within Jewish thought or teaching. That only came later. Even in the time of Jesus, everyone still did not believe in the possibility of life after death. Apparently the Pharisees did, the Sadducees didn't. But yet, despite the fact that verses 26 and 27 of our reading are difficult to translate with any certainty, it nevertheless seems as though Job is actually professing a hope, if not a belief, in a resurrection from the dead. "For I know that my Redeemer lives," in this case God, "and that at the last he will stand upon the earth, and after my skin has been thus destroyed, then in my flesh I shall see God." Life, even after death. And Job clings to this hope even in the midst of his suffering and despair. In the end, as it turns out, Job's fortunes are reversed, but that's not for another 23 chapters yet. For now, still mired in the pain and despair of unrelenting suffering, Job nevertheless expresses a word of hope, indeed the only hope he has left. He simply turns his life over to and trusts God. If the words, "For I know that my Redeemer lives," perhaps sound familiar to you, even though you may know little or nothing about the story of Job in the Bible, it may be because they were immortalized in Handel's Messiah. Jeanette and I were privileged to be invited to go to Carnegie Hall the other year to experience the Messiah performed live. The story is told of a renowned conductor who was once leading a great orchestra and choir in their final rehearsal of Messiah. And they had come to the point where the soprano soloist takes up the refrain, "I know that my Redeemer liveth." And with the chorus quiet, her elegant voice rang out. It was marked by perfect technique in breathing and enunciation. She sang every note just as it was written. And as the final note faded into silence, the entire orchestra fully expected to see the conductor's nod of approval. But instead, he stepped down from the podium and he made his way over to the singer. And with a look of sorrow on his face, he said, "My daughter, you do not really know that your Redeemer lives, do you?" "Why, yes," she blushingly replied. "Then sing it," cried the conductor. "Tell it to me so that I will know, and all who hear you will know that you know the joy and power of it." Turning to the orchestra, he motioned for them to begin again. And this time the soloist forgot all about musical technicalities and instead sang the truth as she knew it in her own soul. And in that moment, the Messiah became more than just a musical piece. It became a declaration of personal faith and hope. How did my friend Doug do it? How did he endure and even persevere despite all the pain and sadness he faced in his life? I don't think there's any question about it. Quite simply, the words of Job in today's reading, "I know that my Redeemer lives," sang out in Doug's heart and in his life each and every day until the day he died. He really knew that his Redeemer lives. Christ lives. Death and the grave could not hold Jesus. And through the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we will also experience new life, both now and in the life and world to come. That's his promise to us. And it's crystal clear to me that the reason why Doug was able to persevere and endure was that he came to know the joy and power of those words as well. In my mind, at least, there can be no other explanation. Amen. We continue now with verse